it's becoming clear and clearer that the countries that have remained commodity dependent tend to be far more unequal than those that have industrialized because of a lack of jobs in non-extractive resources, but also at the political level. These countries are more susceptible to suffer from political capture. The extraction of commodities is often not labor intensive, which means that there'll be kind of value for few, but you can't really employ large segments of the population in those sectors. And these countries also tend to be more vulnerable to commodity price fluctuations.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Future Frame TV. I'm Alice Krozer, your host for the Inequalities channel presented by Traces.Dreams. We are here today to talk about another aspect of inequality in relation to something called industrial policy, and we'll get an explanation in a second about what that actually means by an expert in industrial policy and economic diversification. We have a guest today, Dr. Amir Lebdioui, who is a research fellow at the Latina America Centre at the London School of Economics in the UK. Welcome to the program, Amir.
Thank you, Alice. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been a big fan of your initiative, so thanks for the invitation.
Well, thank you kindly for following the initiative and being here on the program with us today, where we want to talk about this maybe underappreciated subject of something very important, specifically when we talk about inequalities, which is policy and specifically industrial policy. You do a lot of research on this subject in Latin America and in other parts of the world. Could you tell us, to start off and to understand what we are actually talking about, could you tell us what we mean when we say industrial policy? Who does it? What does it consist in? And what do we expect from it?
Thanks, Alice. So, industrial policy, that's a word that is often a taboo in economic circles. But industrial policies are basically a set of policy interventions, so by governments, that have the objective of promoting the structural transformation of an economy. So basically, that can steer the economy towards higher value-added sectors, to create employment, value, technological spillovers, to generate foreign exchange revenues, and so on.
And why would we want some intervention like that? Why would it be desirable under certain circumstances, and if at all? and what would these circumstances be?
I think that's the interesting part, is that industrial policy is, I believe, essential, right, to the diversification of economy, or to the upgrade, technological upgrade of an economy. And this is very important for many reasons. The first one has to do with poverty alleviation, right? These kind of policy measures can help create decent jobs, right, for people. They can help generate revenues and tax revenues that can be spent on social transfers, health, education. And increasingly, there is a kind of a new trend of research within industrial policy showing that industrial policy tools are also helpful in, reducing inequality, but also addressing issues like climate change, and basically addressing societal missions, right? Where we cannot rely on market forces alone to achieve.
And could we take this down from the more abstract level of calling it policy to something concrete to understand how a specific policy measure can translate into one of those goals? Do you have an example maybe that could illustrate that?
Yeah, let me give an example. Well, from Latin America, maybe from Chile in particular, which was one of the countries that I studied for my PhD, along with Malaysia. So Chile used to depend on, in the 1930s, on natural nitrates, right? That basically was the bulk of its exports. But from one day to the other, a German scientist, I think his name was Fritz Haber, discovered how to synthesize nitrate, right? So basically, virtually from one day to the other, Chile's exports crumbled, right? And the country didn't have any more revenues, which generated an economic crisis. Then Chile basically has depended on copper, but the state has been particularly active since the 60s, and sometimes in using industrial policy measures, sometimes in disguise, notably during the seemingly liberal Pinochet regime, to promote the emergence of new sectors, right? To diversify the economy, create jobs and value. And the notable example is the salmon sector, right? This is one of Chile's largest exports. It's the second largest salmon export in the world. And this was predominantly the result of government interventions because the conditions were ideal for salmon farming, but investments were suboptimal, right? Because it takes actually a lot of risks, right, for the first mover to try to develop an industry where it does not exist, right? Understanding if it's possible at all, getting the technology, understanding what kind of species can you grow. So different public agencies have been key in training people, in actually trying experiments, undergoing a trial and error process. And once this succeeded, they basically made the technology and business plan open access for others to follow, right? And the rest was a great success. And there were similar interventions in the forestry sector, in the fruit sector. So basically, the role of the state was essential to diversify the Chile economy and help it develop resilience to, external shocks like the one they've experienced in the 1930s.
You said a minute ago that the government helps, or the intervention of the public sector helps to mitigate these risks that might be associated to first mover from the private sector, right? Could you elaborate a little more on the specific advantage of the public sector beyond a specific government or a specific, let's say, ideological decision by the government to intervene in these decisions, as opposed to leaving it to the private sector? And of course, there is the argument of technically called infant industry protection, or in normal human words, the intervention to foster new research areas that didn't exist before, that might be prosper in the future. Could you say something about the specific role of the government and maybe also the risks that might be attached to this intervention?
Sure. Thanks, Alice. Yeah, one argument that has been popular, especially from the 80s onwards with the Washington Consensus, was that limited government intervention is more desirable, right? That and until today, you hear it very often that the state's role should not be to boost any particular industry or intervene, but investors know best where to invest their money and how to do it. However, there are two ways to look at those things. One is a static way, right, based on a static view of comparative advantage. The other one in a dynamic way. And very often, the determinants that really boost the emergence of an industry in a country are not just based on natural factors. Often they are, if we're talking about a particular natural resource and so on. But very often they're actually policy induced, right? The Japanese, there's nothing inherent about them that makes them better at producing cars. Actually, a lot of it has to do with investments in education and actually particular set of skills that enable workers to apply those skills in a particular industry, including an infrastructure as well, right? The type of infrastructure that is necessary, public infrastructure, I'm talking, right? Road, ports, and even more digital systems nowadays that are key for the productivity of a sector. And those things are very hard to manage by the private sector alone, right? Very often because they actually serve society as a whole. They might be too expensive for a private investor, but they can be managed basically by public investments and to boost the productivity of private investments. So yeah, in a way, including in Latin America and sometimes in the African context too, the discussions have often remained on what we're currently good at, what can we produce, but based on our natural resources, but not so much in terms of what could we produce, right? If this type of investment was done, and so on. And very interestingly, even when you talk about natural resources, right? When it's non-renewable resources, they're kind of specific to the place. But when they're not, very often, these are also policy induced. For example, as I just mentioned, salmon farming in Chile, right? There was no salmon in Chile before the 1980s, right? But through policies, they found conditions were ideal for those things, and training people and investing in R&D for this to happen. But similarly, palm oil and rubber in Malaysia, these are not plants that originate from Malaysia, right? And across the world, there are examples like this. Now, the risks are tangible, right? Governments can make mistakes, right? And especially they can keep betting and subsidizing an industry that is failing to become competitive, and that can become very costly for taxpayers. However, there is a counter there's something that needs to be said, which is the fact that what you need for structural transformation is not just any industrial policy, is what people call smart industrial policy, right? Or true industrial policy, a good industrial policy, like any other thing, right? It's not just about the fact that it's there, but it needs to be done well. What distinguishes, for example, Latin America's experiment with industrial policy, mostly in the 80s with East Asia, was the presence of monitoring and evaluation mechanisms, but also the stick. So not just giving the carrot to firms, but also the ability to discontinue support if performance requirements were not met, right? Something that people often don't know as well is that firms like Toyota, they were subsidized by the government for 40 years and they were actually running at loss, right? But there was a clear vision in terms of it can become competitive eventually. And even in South Korea, firms that were not performing, support was discontinued. In Latin America, very often the support was granted, so the carrot was given, but the stick was not applied or conditions were not met. So obviously, it's very important for industrial policy to be successful that there are clear criteria, right, in terms of performances to meet, and the kind of, not punishment, I want to say, but the kind of
consequences,
measures that will be applied if performances are not met.
You said a while ago that it was a taboo to talk about, or it remains a taboo in certain circles in economic research and certainly in policy application to talk about or to implement industrial policy. Could you say a little bit more about why it's still contentious? And, beyond the risks that you mentioned now, of course, the government can fail, as can businesses also, and they do all the time, right? So in that sense, of course, it's an argument to have a look out for these issues, but it's not really an argument to say we don't want to do it or it's something negative, considering that businesses have the same problem. Could you say a little bit more about this contentiousness, where it comes from, or what could be the trigger behind it?
Yeah, well, basically, industrial policies have often, been sometimes fairly, but very often unfairly associated with inefficiencies and abusive interventionism, elite capture, right? Because once the state decides to favor some industries or activities over others, there are risks of cronyism and so on. And in the kind of 80s with structural adjustment programs, most industrial policy measures were discontinued in developing countries. I think one other problem that I think is interesting to talk about is the fact that is the narrative, right, regarding past success. There is a lot of work that needs to be done on differentiating the good from the bad and the ugly. So basically, a lot of past experiences were unfairly attributed to abusive government interventions. A lot of past successes are not. The role of government interventions was heavily underrepresented. A little anecdote here, for example, is the electric car industry in the US. So if you read Elon Musk's biography, you would just hear a lot about, the kind of the genius of the inventor and, capitalism and the business plan. And, but I think there is about one paragraph that is devoted to the massive subsidized credit they received from the Obama administration. I mean, this was $500 million, right? And this was a moment for them that if they didn't receive that subsidized credit, they would have, collapsed. But I think in the kind of public narrative of those things, the role when it's successful, right? We don't necessarily talk about the government support that was behind, but we talk about the firms that were very successful. And that contributes to industrial policy not having a bad rep. But in recent years, I think across the world, there is more appetite for governments to intervene in the right way, right? To steer economic development towards more inclusive and dynamic development. And this is due to several factors. Over the past 20 years, there's been, I think, growing dissatisfaction with free market policies, persistence of high poverty rates, inequality problems, limited areas, comparative advantage in developing countries, make the return of coherent industrial policies very, very relevant. And you can also see it in the change of the narrative. Now, institutions like the IMF and World Bank do talk about the role of industrial policies in their report. Just recently, the United States announced that it will vote on a bill to use industrial policy to counteract China, right? And countries have done industrial policy, including the US, the EU, also calling it different names, right, to avoid to avoid the stigma associated with industrial policy. In the US, it's actually R&D policy, right? They just fund subsidize firms through R&D, essentially.
Research and development.
Exactly, yeah, research and development, or other kind of elaborate mechanisms to help domestic firms. The EU has actually relied a lot on quality standards, right, to do what you mentioned earlier, infant industry protection, to prevent the import of certain goods and favor, the domestically produced goods. Once I've talked to a policymaker in Chile who mentioned that no, Chile does not do industrial policy because they don't choose sectors. They make strategic bets based on global market opportunities, right? Which is basically the same thing, but the phrasing was different. But anyways, my point being that now there's less stigma associated with it, especially as advanced nations, advanced economies are increasingly acknowledging that they're using industrial policies or needing industrial policies. So hopefully things are changing in the right direction.
And the key here is acknowledging, as you say, right? Because part of the stigma maybe also comes from historic intervention and specifically, for example, the USSR experience of heavy intervention and control of markets through state intervention at a very large scale. Probably did something to the bad image of, or its failures did something to the bad image of industrial policy, while at the same time, of course, its counterparts, as you say, the US, the EU, most of the currently advanced economies, wealthier economies, they also always conducted industrial policy, as you say, sometimes under different names, sometimes more subtly, or sometimes simply by their legal or formal frameworks that help research into specific industries or disincentivize other industries. Why is it such a problem for them to acknowledge that they have done it all the time? And what is the change that they're acknowledging it now?
That's an excellent question. I think that that probably more research should be done on that, right? Why don't you? Well, a cynical answer is that, well, because they don't want others to do it too, right? Because, well, you kind of benefit from open markets, especially in an era of globalization where there is increasing competition for the export of different goods and services. So I think that historically there's always been an incentive to do industrial policy but prevent others from doing so. I mean, Hadjun Cheng has that book called Kicking Away the Ladder, right? So kind of not letting others use the tools that you've used yourself to get to where you are. And unfortunately, I think there are still some remnants of this attitude until today at the WTO and other arenas. But again, I think there is growing acknowledgement that some of these countries are using those tools is sending a strong message to developing countries. I mean, you see it even in the era of COVID, right? I already mentioned the C word within a few minutes. There's been a growing realization from people in developing countries that they cannot keep relying on foreign technology, on the exported manufactured goods, and including medical goods, right? As a result of the pandemic, and even access to vaccine has even pushed the African Union to start thinking about how to boost R&D for vaccines and vaccine manufacturing capabilities in Africa, so that for future pandemics, hopefully there won't be any, but for future pandemics, they will be more ready, right, and prepared for these kind of eventualities. There's also the fact that the countries that tend to depend on commodity exports and tourism and the import of manufactured goods have fared worse than those that depend on the export of sophisticated manufactured goods as a result of the pandemic, right? As governments imposed lockdown and travel restrictions, commodity prices went down, tourism revenues went down, and supply chains were disrupted. So there seems to be a wake-up call, right, regarding the localization and regionalization of some supply chains and avoiding the dependence on key or on a few foreign supplier for essential goods.
And as you say, the C word, the situation currently, the pandemic, probably also brought home the point that the response to a crisis matters dramatically, right? And that was probably downplayed for a while. And you mentioned our professor, Dr. Hajun Chang at Cambridge that we met there, who investigated these issues for decades. And his home country, South Korea, is, of course, the standard example of economic development success and was heavily influenced by industrial policy. In this context, it becomes very obvious that, as you say, the narrative is that it's not something good, still everybody does it. And I want to relate it here to the issue of inequalities, because specifically this argument of kicking away the ladder that Hajun Chang promotes is that industrialized or wealthier countries promoted these policies and then said to the poorer nations, no, you're not allowed to do that, and it's not ethically or economically sound to use these policies. What do you think was the impact in terms of international inequality of this narrative?
The stigma around industrial policy.
Yes.
I think it's becoming clearer and clearer, especially over the past couple of years, looking back, at the period since the 2000s, that the countries that have remained commodity dependent, right? So dependent on the exports of, agriculture goods or extractive resources such as fossil fuels, tend to be far more unequal than those that have industrialized because of basically a lack of jobs in non-extractive resources, but also at the political level. These countries are more susceptible to suffer from political capture. The extraction of commodities is often not labor intensive, which means that there'll be kind of value for few, but you can't really employ large segments of the population in those sectors. And these countries also tend to be more vulnerable to commodity price fluctuations, right? So when commodity prices drop, there's no more money for social spending, social transfers. And this is actually something that we can learn from the Latin American experience with inequality reduction in the 2000s, where that was correlated with a commodity boom. And broadly speaking, across Latin America, policymakers have tended to manage this boom much better than previous ones, and for mostly redistributive purposes. So invested a lot in education and other types of social transfers, health, or conditional cash transfers, and so on, helping to reduce some, inequality rates according to some measurements. But after commodity prices went down in 2014, this model was not sustainable, right? So actually the investment in conditional cash transfers has also dropped massively across the region. I think it's about $3 billion of reduction in conditional cash transfers from 2014 to 2015. Public revenues shrank, which means that there was less investment in infrastructures, less job creation. In those years, Latin America is the region in the world where unemployment rates went up the most, right? And that led to basically a re-increase of inequality rates, and the need to think about better models to reduce inequality on the long term.
Of course, this also says something about where we want to head as a society or as a country, right? To make these strategic decisions. What are the consequences of choosing one industry over another in terms of societal development?
Yeah, this is an excellent question to which I'm not sure I can provide a definitive answer but basically it would depend on the context. The long-term objective should be to promote the emergence of value-added activities, right? And here I think it's very important to distinguish the type of activity versus the sector. The reason why I'm saying this is that very often people associate with primary commodities with, something that is not value-added or low-skilled jobs and so on. But what matters is not the final, basically, product that you export as much as what is it that is being done locally. So I'll go again with the example of salmon farming in Chile. Salmon farming seems to be, it's a primary commodity, but the Chileans have managed to localize a lot of the supply of goods and services around salmon farming, but that includes, very high technological capabilities around, fish vaccines and quality control labs, and in order to export fresh salmon across the Pacific to Japan, you also need very good cold storage infrastructure capabilities and so on, right? But obviously, I think the final objective should be thinking not just about the product, but the kind of capabilities that you need for this product. And likewise, there are countries that export electronics, but these are mostly just assembled parts, right? Where the skills are actually, the Mexican maquiladora system is very much in that spirit, right? I mean, the goods can be sophisticated, but the activity isn't. Now, however, in the context of a developing country that is trying to reduce inequality by promoting diversification or using industrial policies, it's very important to be realistic about the current, the best ways to absorb the people who are currently left out of the labor market, right? So if the majority of the population has very little skills, I think in some instances, and there is a large part of the population that is unemployed, it's very important to steer the economy also towards labor-intensive sectors, right? That can absorb that amount of labor and make sure that income is more redistributed in that fashion. In those instances, if you only invest in high-tech sectors where the people that have the right type of skills to get those jobs, if they're too little, I mean, that will create more inequality, right? Because their wages are going to increase because there's not enough of those people with these type of skills relatively to the others. So that's not the outcome that you necessarily want. The other thing is that even if countries invest in labor-intensive industries, it does not preclude, the kind of vision to increase value over time, right? And I think a lot of countries started off this way, including, South Korea that you mentioned, and Malaysia, and China. Many countries that are now industrialized have started with sectors, labor-intensive sectors with low value added, but over time there's still that vision and industrial policies to make sure that there were opportunities for value addition and upgrading in those value chains. So I hope this answer, and obviously the kind of sectors that should emerge. Generally speaking, it's best that the governments don't put all their eggs in the same basket, right? Just focusing on one sector or one type of activity, but trying to make sure that different type of sectors can emerge thanks to their policies. Yeah.
So it's not only doing industrial policy, it's also how and why you do it and what for, and complex questions about the objectives and the process to get there. Amir, how did you get interested in these subjects in the first place? It's not something that, you wake up as a child and when they ask you, what will you do in your future? You say, I want to be an industrial policy scholar, or was it like that in your case?
Yeah, no, it definitely was not like this. However, I'm from Algeria, and this is a country that still depends, on fossil fuels for over 97% of its exports. So basically, growing up in a country that is highly dependent on fossil fuels, you do realize what are the dangers associated with this. When commodity prices are up, no one really worries, right? But when they go down, this is when you face very deep problems. And the need for diversification in Algeria is something that I've heard since I can remember. This was always an objective, a need, but it never happened. So as I went to study, I initially I wanted to be an architect, but that plan went down the drain. But I was really interested in kind of figuring out why is it that it has not happened, right?
You becoming
What
an
is it?
architect?
Yeah, but then I realized that before this, we actually needed to. I mean, there were kind of more, let's say, immediate dangers that we needed basically to face, and that kind of drew my interest in that field. But yeah, I'm still fascinated by architecture, but just as a hobby. Um, and basically, this opened up, this whole kind of idea of, well, the kind of type of state interventions that you need, right, to overcome dependence on fossil fuels, which is becoming increasingly relevant in the context of climate change, right? As the world decarbonizes, a lot of these natural assets or fossil fuels are at risk of becoming what they call stranded assets, right? So assets that have a negative value. And yeah, when I basically started my PhD, I wanted to understand what other governments have done, right, to successfully diversify the economies. And this is when I realized across the countries I was studying that states had a key role to play almost systematically, which kind of increased my interest in industrial policy.
Amir, thank you so much for sharing this story and sharing your insights and your knowledge about the importance and the ways of industrial policy all over the world. We're very happy to have some new insights on these subjects now. Thank you all for watching another episode of Future Frame TV. If you like these subjects, if you want to learn more about inequalities, subscribe to our channel or come and watch another episode next week again. I'm Alice Krozer, your host for the Inequalities channel of Future Frame TV, presented by Traces.Dreams. Have a nice afternoon and hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.